Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and continuing on the theme of Halloween and scary things, I was talking about all these horror movies, and I was kind of doing some research on horror movies and horror-related topics, because one of the things that comes up fairly regularly, and I talked about Leatherface, right? And if you go back to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it says, based upon true events. And that's a recurring theme in a lot of horror movies, as well as crime thrillers and those kind of things. And it got me thinking about serial killers, which is a topic I've talked about having, hopefully, a guest. I'm finding it incredibly difficult to get subject matter experts on a lot of topics to come on the show. Obviously, I'm not very good at that piece of being a podcaster. Otherwise, I would be joined by someone tonight that is an expert on the topic. So that leaves it to me to do research, which those of you who listen to the show know it's sometimes hit or miss about my research and how good of a thorough job I do on it. But I came across a couple of statistics. So obviously the real craze in horror movies, we talked about it last week as far as like the timeline of when things really began to pick up. And of course you have your, late 70s into your early 80s. So this is going to be potentially a multi-part series, because what I found out, and I was going to do serial killers of basically our generation. And when I say our generation, I mean from the times that we have been alive. And your serial killer boom, for lack of a better term, of the 1970s into the 1980s and then into the 1990s. Everything from, Netflix and Amazon and all of those networks are running programming with this subject matter. I think part of it is because it's just so fascinating how fractured and tortured the human mind really is, and what would drive people to such disturbing lengths and such a lack of concern or care for another human being, and in fact, to revel in it. It's really terrifying. And the compartmentalization that occurs with some of these people is astounding. So this is what I discovered, and I found this piece really interesting. So again, using the timeline, I didn't even pull up the 1960s. I just went right to the 1970s because there was this graph I found, and it has this huge spike. Now, bear in mind that from the 1970s on, we're in a different era of media and media sensationalism, right? Easy for me to say. So that's a piece of it. So I don't want it to be forgotten that part of the reason, and I talked about it on episode 1, and then I talked about it on the episode about, key events that happened in Gen X, in my opinion, like some of the key events. And I, talked about Adam Walsh. But part of it is once you have national news media, things that would have previously been highly regionalized, things of this nature are easy to really sensationalize right off the bat, but then you have a national platform for it. Well, now it becomes titillating, just like the paparazzi. It's all about taking these traumatic, crazy events and monetizing it. So again, that recurring theme that I've had for a couple of episodes now is trauma as commerce, and how we both, I think as human beings, we're both really empathizing and feeling such sadness and just such a, particularly as parents, like when we become parents and we think about some of these stories, and it breaks your heart on such a crazy level. But then you're also, as a parent and as a human being, wondering how the hell does someone get to this point? Now, certainly there are some recurring themes, and we'll get into that a little bit. But here's what really popped out on the graph is that the 1970s had 286 victims of serial killers. The 1980s saw a drop down to a 259. And the 1990s, it was like down again, like quote unquote down. It's like 199 or 198, something like that. These are human beings specifically targeted. And as we go through some of the perpetrators here, and you listen to like and again, this is not meant to be indelicate, but their kill count. So this isn't the same thing as talking about a kill count from a horror movie. Like, these are real people. And some of these killers are prolific in the worst possible way. Awful. But here's a interesting thing. And one of the things that is obvious is, how come we're not experiencing that today? And one of the key things that people talk about is there's just different safety measures. I think parenting changed. I think Adam Walsh was such a big piece of that. But this is what a professor, James Allen Fox of Northeastern University, says as far as why we don't have this occurring anymore, or at least we think. Changes in how parents think about their children's safety also mean some of the most common targets for serial killers, young women and girls, are less vulnerable than in decades past. According to Fox, Levin, and Friedel, of the 5,582 victims killed by serial killers since wow, that's a different stat than the graph. Holy cow. Okay, the graph is different than these professors who have, well, okay, so they've done it since 1970. Okay, that would make sense, but that would mean that these numbers are really higher. Of course, now we're on, 50 plus years. Maybe this is right. I don't know. That seems much higher than the graph showed. Can't believe everything you see on the internet. But of the 5,582 victims killed by serial killers since 1970, more than half are female. About 30.2% of those female victims are between the ages of 20 and 29, and the 23% are between the ages of 5 and 19. Easy targets, which also disgusts me because anything to do with children and young people, what is the pathology there? Other than the fact that it's like this, easy targets. It's weak people doing weak things to the weak, and that makes them feel strong. And it's terrible. But anyway, those numbers are even higher than like I said, the graph that I looked at. But another key thing is technology has changed things, because now there's pretty much a camera just about everywhere you go, from doorbell cameras to just surveillance cameras just about everywhere. Now, that in of itself is a little bit scary because, those kind of things can be manipulated, and that's a whole nother terrifying thing with AI. I mean, that we could go down a whole nother road on that, but I want to keep it to this topic. But technology has certainly changed things. It's also changed how policing is done from a forensics perspective, particularly with DNA. And DNA is a very easy and not exactly foolproof, but high % confidence when you have a crime scene that you're going to get the right person. And DNA has actually exonerated so many people that have gotten as far as death row for crimes that they did not commit. So DNA has also changed crime and justice in not only this country, but all throughout the world. So there was an article in Rolling Stone magazine. This was published a couple of years ago, and this was written by someone by the name of Brenna Elric. I don't read Rolling Stone. I did many years ago, like 30 years ago. But said, why were there so many serial killers between 1970 and 2000, and where did they go? So I'm going to focus more on kind of where they came from, right? So there was this really interesting paragraph that I had read. So it's an era that was coined as the golden age of serial murder by Harold Schechter, who's a crime historian, okay? And he talks about everything from sociology, biology, technology, linguistics, all of those things. But one of the key things is over the course of his work, which began in 79, Vronsky had deduced that serial killers generally develop the personality and compulsion befitting a killer when they're young. By the time they're 14, they're basically fully formed. They generally start killing in their late 20s, and as such, he looked back at what was happening in the world when murderers like John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Ted Bundy were growing up, and discovered a link. They were all born during wartime. In cases like the BTK killer, Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, and their fathers were returning war veterans, likely with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which was not diagnosable illness until the 80s. In short, these children were already predisposed to violence, were then raised in a potentially violent, likely broken home. So that in and of itself is obviously a factor that impacts society as a whole. Like these kind of broken homes and violence in the home, right? But now you're looking at people who have literally been at war, more often than not, likely killing other human beings, and then expected to come back and re-ingratiate into society. And many have said that it's a very difficult transition to make. And sometimes people never really recover, which is why you have entirely too many people who have served our country who are currently homeless. That's an aside, nothing to do with the topic, but still very, very important that people who have served in combat get the help that they need. So, another writer, Detective Paul Holes, who had worked on the Golden State Killer case, thinks that's an oversimplification. Because I was looking at a lot of men from that time period when he was working that case and their backgrounds. Now, most men had some affiliation with military, whether because of the war, they were drafted. So there's this tendency to go, aha, you caught the serial killer, and so that must be what created the serial killer, the military piece. But you have everything from one killer who had witnessed his sister being raped and attacked on a military base, right? That was a traumatic event that, does that automatically mean that that person will become a sexual predator themselves? Not necessarily, but what other predispositions did that person have, right? I could see somebody like Phil Hughes, who serial killer, when he sees violence being inflicted on his sister, he's not being traumatized. He's being stimulated by it. That is insane, right? And then neuroscientist James Fallon, who is a self-diagnosed psychopath and author of The Psychopath Inside, a neuroscientist's personal journey into the dark side of the brain, agrees with Vronsky and Holes when it comes to serial killers being the children of war. He's more interested, however, in figuring out why these particular people become killers when the majority of wartime babies went on to live relatively peaceful lives. So, some of these disorders, psychopathy, sociopathy, other serious personality disorders, are basically coded for aggression and violence, low emotional empathy, low anxiety, low reactivity. So, normal people, relatively mild. These disorders are mild if you had basically a good upbringing, right? So this guy who's a self-diagnosed psychopath, never been to jail, never been in trouble. Says, but then if you bring a dad into the home with PTSD or a dominating mother or abuse, then all bets are off, right? So it's not just physiological. It's not just like, gene based, right? It's just in your genes. It's also environment. So you do have this kind of mixture of nature and nurture combined. So here's an interesting thing, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of things in a bit. All of the people that I've ever studied, every murderer and every dictator, every one of them was either abandoned or abused between birth and 3 years old, except for Pol Pot. He said he had a great upbringing and would have loved to have seen his brain to wonder how he could have gotten there. But the last really interesting piece is that almost every single one of them suffered some form of frontal lobe injury, right? So childhood frontal lobe injuries are often reported in serial killer biographies. And as he puts it, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, never had a chance, in his opinion, because he had a Vietnam veteran cousin who was suffering from PTSD who told him stories from the war while he's very, very little. So he's had this brain injury, and then he's being fed these stories of just awfulness from a, obviously disturbed, suffering veteran. And one of the other things they talk about is how just the ease of it all, particularly at this time, because one of the other things that was very prevalent and why they believe that it was oftentimes young women who were the target, but not exclusively, as we'll talk about in a little bit. Hitchhiking. And I said that on a couple of episodes. Hitchhiking was so widespread. It was an easy way to get to point A to point B. 9 times out of 10, you were completely safe. Unfortunately, that 1 out of 10 times, you could possibly have run into a serial killer. And that's something that has significantly changed. Obviously, people just simply don't do that anymore for a lot of really good reasons. So let's get into the list. So I said this could be multi-parts because my initial compulsion was, hey, I'm going to talk about, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the stuff that, we refer to kind of as the Gen X wheelhouse. But then I go to the Wikipedia page and the list is just immense. And this goes back all the way to the 1800s. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to start in 1970. Now, some of these individuals, I'm just going to say that they are amongst either the most famous, and I hate to think of the fact that they're famous, and I'm not going to get into each and every one of them. I'm just going to kind of give a synopsis, and yeah, this is where that media sensationalism really is such a key component of it. And, if this is a topic that interests you, certainly you probably know some of these, and I don't want to get too much into the heinousness of their actions, because many of these have documentaries, they've been featured in a lot of different things. I mean, I'm fascinated by it just because I can't understand. Like, I really can't understand. And what's really interesting to me, as we'll get into it, is crime and punishment as it exists, particularly in certain parts of the country. Because one of the things that also came up quite a bit is location. Now, you have a couple of folks who are in the Midwest, but many are in California, Oregon, and Washington State. So what is it about those areas? Now, I didn't even dig into the geography of it all and what elements are in place in the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast during this time, other than just obviously what we've talked about already, which is like this military connection and obviously, potential abuse. Very few of these folks didn't have some form of abuse. In fact, I think the first one, who's one of the absolute worst, if there can be such a thing, from 1970 to 1973, Dean Corll, who was confirmed at least 28 victims. He's also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper. And all of his victims, with the exception, I think, of one or two, were all teenage males. Some as young as 13 years old. Those are babies. And, you know, he had a family with, the reason he's called a Candyman is they were successful with numerous businesses in the candy production industry. But his mom was a habitual marrier, having multiple divorces. They moved around a bunch and various different types of relationships with, you know, the stepfathers and, you know, being sent to live with grandparents and all those kind of things. But he's also called the Pied Piper because, again, he was able to ply these young people, these young men, with promises of alcohol and drugs. But initially, it was just candy because these are young kids in the 70s. Like they always say, don't take candy from strangers, right? This is why. Because of people like Dean Corll. Now, what really makes his story even more nauseating is that he ended up having teenage accomplices. Let's see, Henry Brooks, I think it's Henry Brooks, and William Henley, teenagers themselves, who used his methodology, promises of candy, drugs, alcohol. Hey, there's this cool older guy. He's got his own place. We can go party. And he would pay them $200 per victim. $200 for a human life. Children being sold to a serial killer. Not just a serial killer, a sadistic sexual torturer who had a torture board that he built out of plywood. And I won't get into anything else, but just he had this torture board. The only reason that his particular crime spree came to an end is because of young Mr. Henley, who had made the mistake and almost died himself by bringing a young woman to the home. Because Corll only liked to prey on young men. He was uneasy with women. So even having this girl in his house really agitated him, right? And he was going to kill 3 of them. It was Henley, a male friend, and this female friend. And somehow Henley talked him down from himself being killed, but got a gun that was in the house because he had been an accomplice and said, you can't just keep killing all of my friends. And Corll said, you won't do it. And he did. He shot him, killed him, and then called the police and took his punishment. And both Brooks and Henley, life in prison for being the accomplice to so many murders. Now, Corll is going to come up again later on because he, in fact, inspired another of the most famous serial killers of all time. Now, next, from 1970 to 1987. Now, one of the things you'll find with a lot of these is they're relatively short term, and some really only acted within like 1 year. But the Angel of Death, Donald Harvey, who was confirmed for 37 but implicated in over 80 murders. And here's an interesting piece because we know that this was the time period for the Satanic Panic. He actually did use victims for occult rituals. So they say, oh, it never happened. It did, just probably not to the level that the media made it out to be. But to say that it never occurred would not exactly be true. Talk about prolific career. Samuel Little, 1970 to 2005. 61 confirmed, but suspected for over 90. I mean, just that period of time. And again, young women. Yeah, just the kind of the standard. So that's the whole thing. So Corll exclusively preyed on males. Harvey, I think, was male and female, and then Little, just female. And I think it's a combination of sex workers, but also breaking and entering, and sometimes just crimes of expedience. Next, we have a very famous guy, one who is able to use charm and good looks in order to get to his victims. 1971 to 1978, we have Ted Bundy. 28 murders, as we all know. 6, I believe, in one night in one sorority house. He was once described as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you've ever met. And his story was he would pretend to be an injured guy with like a cast on his arm, had a fake cast, drove around in the most unassuming Volkswagen Beetle, and the ages of his victims, all young women between the ages of 12 and 25. What's interesting about Bundy is that he did become valuable as basically like not a criminal informant, but more a consultant, because he really did get his own kind of pathology. Like, he understood, and he could read, reports from the FBI or local law enforcement and kind of give you a rough sketch of what he believed. And he was right a number of times. So in that regard, he was an asset, but still showed relatively little to no remorse. I do believe he had a positive message upon his execution for his one daughter. But here's another thing that's so interesting about justice. Now, I'm not here to give any kind of positive thumbs up, thumbs down for the death penalty as a solution. Okay. I have my opinions. I'm sure you have yours. But what's interesting is that because the state of California did not have it either all of this time or much of this time, there are only 3 guys on this entire list with these massive kill counts that were actually executed. And I just think that's fascinating. So Bundy was executed in 1989, basically 11 years after he had finally been caught and convicted. Yeah, just brutal. Now, many have said that he is an example of someone who would physically change, because I do think that he had 1 or 2 people, 2 young women who escaped, or maybe just one, and he was one of those guys that had a full, like, physical or facial change when he was in these, states of murder. Oh. Now, here's one that's, I don't want to minimize it and say a small count, right? But he also has this kind of interesting trivia footnote. So from 1971 and 1979, Rodney Alcala, who was confirmed with 8 victims, but had been either implicated or suspected in perhaps 50 or more, but he was on The Dating Game, thus dubbed the Dating Game Killer. And here's the thing. If you guys remember that show, 3 bachelors will be behind, a wall, and there's think about The Bachelor before it was The Bachelor. And there'd be a young lady who is going to ask them different questions. And then based upon their answers, she's going to decide which one she's going to take out on a date. Alcala won. But then when she met him, said she immediately felt uneasy, scared. He was creepy, and never went through on the date. Crazy. 1971 to 1983, and this is not a guy you want having that long of a reign of terror. And this is the scorecard killer, Randy Kraft. Now, he was convicted of 16, but the scorecard, which by all accounts was proven accurate, his own scorecard that he kept in the trunk of his car, that was very specific to each one of what they believe were 67 kills. And one of the most sadistic of the group. Too much for me to get into his modus operandi and some of the things that medical examiners, coroners had to deal with in the aftermath of being a victim of the scorecard killer. And again, oftentimes, teenage males. Like any human being who's dealing with this kind of scenario, I feel for, but when you're talking about kids, man, it irks me in a whole entirely different and profound way. And it just, these young people so scared and literally in more pain than any of us could possibly imagine. 67 young people at the hands of this maniac who kept a scorecard because he's proud of what he did. Also in 1971 and 1983, we have the man who is known as the Butcher Baker, Mr. Robert Hansen. 17 known victims, up to 21. Here's what makes this little nugget of hell, by all accounts, a successful man. Now, some of these guys were very successful in their careers and their lives, and part of that is why they had income and homes and those kind of things. Some of them did come from well-to-do families. Whether the family was abusive is irrelevant when it comes to just financial means. There's also the fact that, they would steal from victims, etc. But this guy was so successful as a butcher, as a baker. He was well known in his community. In fact, many people didn't even think that it could possibly be him, but he owned his own property in Alaska. And he was also a licensed pilot. So he would take his victims and fly them to this property in Alaska, oftentimes wounded, so already in a weakened state, and release them on his property. And then he would hunt them with a hunting rifle, like animals. The only reason that he was stopped was because a young woman who had made it all the way to the plane said, "I might die anyway," and booked it. And just so happened to have a truck that was driving either adjacent or across the airfield where the airplane was stored, and was able to be saved and ultimately get him. Imagine that. Imagine dealing with torture, abuse, etc., and then say, "Hey, if you could run away from me, you're free," in the Alaskan wilderness while he hunted you. That's just a level of sadism. All of them are sadistic in different ways. Like, that's the whole thing. And now, one of, again, the most famous, 1972 to 1978, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. I believe he was known as Pogo the Clown or something like that. 33 victims, again, teenage men, boys. He was inspired by Dean Corll. So I mentioned that Dean Corll had this torture board. Now, the means of securing his victims were handcuffs, and he talked about plying them with alcohol and drugs, to which he would then handcuff them. So Gacy, as a clown, would do like tricks, and one of them was, hey, I have this cool handcuff trick. So usually he had gotten them stoned, maybe smoking some pot, have a couple of beers, and they would put the handcuff on their own wrist, thinking that it was part of a game, only for him to then restrain them. And the whole thing is, Gacy was also very verbal. Like, he's the only one that they talked about, like how verbal he was, mocking, and I've got you. Now, here's the whole thing about Gacy. His father, sorry, I don't know why I said brother. His father kind of thought he was a little soft, called him some, less than nice names. One term that's often used for homosexual men. And the thing is, for Gacy, he was like, but I'm not that. Why doesn't my father like me? And he had gotten married, had kids, but then he did start to kind of go down that road. So then you wonder, like, would he have gone down that path if it wasn't for the fact that his father was constantly calling him that? You don't know, because kids are impressionable, right? And they start to take these things to heart. But apparently, for all intents and purposes, like, his parents and mom in particular always kept trying to help him. His dad had like bailed him out of jail and gave him legal representation the first time that he got busted, essentially involved in homosexual behavior with a staffer where he worked. I think it was his dad's company or something like that. And it was a teenage boy who was like, hey, dude, this guy, Gacy, man, like, he did this stuff to me. And he ended up doing some time and then getting out, and they still helped him. And apparently he then settled down, seemingly got all of his shit together again, married, wife, all of that. His father said to him, I was wrong about you, John. Put her there. All this validation. Obviously, it came too late in Gacy's life, because it didn't stop him from continuing to spiral. Apparently, after he was caught, when he got the news that his father had passed away, he broke down sobbing. So, complex relationship, certainly. But again, to be inspired by Dean Corll is just, ugh. But like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy was executed for his crimes in 1994. Now, here we have someone who had a just banner year. He just got after it. So in 1974, Paul John Knowles, responsible for the murder of 18, I think most of them are women, like something like 16 out of them were all women. He was known as the Casanova Killer. Good-looking, charismatic, but some said sometimes he did just come off a little bit creepy. That something would just kind of shift. But what made Knowles so difficult was that it was across multiple states with no consistent MO. It was just, okay, what's here? Whether it be strangulation or stabbing or using different things, like it was just, you couldn't trace him because each crime was not necessarily different, but no consistent MO, no consistent like age group. It seemed like it was crimes of convenience. If he broke into your house, if you were a 60-year-old woman or a 15-year-old girl, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. 1974, 1982, Carl Eugene Watts, the Sunday morning slasher. All women. I didn't write down here. He was another one that had quite the big number. Let's see. trying not to lose my screen here. Let's see. Oh, does this crash? Nope. All right, hold on. Go back to this. Not that it really matters. I just feel as though I've done it for everyone else. Here I am being fair to a serial killer. Ridiculous. Number of victims, 22, but implicated in perhaps up to 100. And again, a little bit of a no specific MO or method: stabbing, slashing, strangulation, drowning, and bludgeoning. All females between the age of 14 and 44 years old. All right, so let's go back here. Okay. Oh, these guys. So I'd listened to a podcast with a writer, and I'm forgetting her name, and I could always go look it up, but she was on the Talk is Jericho podcast because she had written a book about her experiences getting to know Lawrence Bittaker, who, along with Roy Norris, went on a crime spree in 1979, and they were dubbed the Toolbox Killers. They had, by the way, decided that they were going to kidnap, sexually torture, physically torture, and murder one girl of each age, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. That was their goal. A goal that they came up with while in prison. And this story, it takes on a whole number of different paths, but the writer of that book, gosh, I'm forgetting her name. I can't look it up, but she got to know Bittaker. So that was her whole goal. He didn't really talk to press. And if he did talk to press, he was highly manipulative, right? So very, very intelligent, something like 138 IQ, and never really had much outlet for it. So by the way, he was conceived and born to a couple that had decided that they weren't going to have kids. So they just had him, gave him up for adoption immediately. And by all accounts, like overbearing kind of dad, and like they moved around a lot because his dad was like, again, military. But nothing was there to anticipate the level of depravity. And it really wasn't until really late in his life where he had cancer and he was dying that he's like, I'm scared of dying. And I didn't know what that was like. And he goes, it's probably the first time in my life that I have even the slightest idea of what my victims went through, because I'm scared of dying. In part because he was scared of where he may be going, which, if you believe in an afterlife, he's going to hell. And one of the things that also is notable about the case is that the detective who put them away was never the same, and in fact committed suicide later on, just because he was terrified of the fact that what if they got out on parole? Like, just terrified of them. And what made the actual trial so challenging for everyone in the courtroom, the judge, the prosecutors, everyone, the press, was a tape. And I feel I'm going to pull it up because I think it's important, because this young woman who lost her life, her name is important because ultimately it was an audio tape of her torture and death that changed the entire trajectory of the case, Shirley Lynette Ledford. And they were particularly brutal to her. And eventually asked, just kill me. And she was 16 years old. It changed everyone who heard it. Meanwhile, Bittaker is on the stand going, what's the big deal? You guys are taking it the wrong way. I promise this was all consensual. She's just play acting. Like, dude, you killed her. We can hear it. This is the most horrific thing anyone's ever heard. So, yeah, that one's tough. Every time I read about that case, yeah, dude, just awful. Yeah, Shirley Lynette Ledford. Ultimately, she did not die in vain, because that was the absolute, there's no way they're getting off. Because there's always some kind of technicality, or like, well, you can't really prove it. Like, all of it. Like, that was definitive proof. And it put them away for life. They both died in prison. Now, around the same time, similar MO, you have William Bonin, the freeway killer, from 1979 to 1980. 21 confirmed, but up to 36 or more. He's like the mirror of Bittaker and Norris in the fact that, you know, Bittaker and Norris focused on teenage girls. Bonin focused on teenage boys, also using a van, also decked out specifically for torture. And yeah, just awful stuff with these couple. You know, these are the two that I've probably read the most about. Yeah, it's unbelievable that human beings can have this level of depravity. So from 1979 to 1986, you have Joseph James D'Angelo. Now, here's an example. So I'm going to try to bring the energy up. I know it's a difficult topic, right? It's fascinating. It's interesting, but I'm realizing as I'm going along, it's exhausting, right? So imagine someone who's in law enforcement, right? Who is going over case after case after case and having to deal with all of this material. And I haven't even seen it. I've just read about this stuff. I mean, I can't even imagine what homicide detectives deal with. Not a job I would ever want. And you need people in the world to do that. And, you know, God bless them. I can't imagine what keeps them up at night. But Joseph James D'Angelo had 3 separate nicknames because he was prolific in 3 different types of crimes. He was originally known as the Visalia Ransacker. Broke into homes, ransacked them, stole stuff, ditched. Something like 50 or 60 homes were ransacked. But then he began to escalate in his crimes. So then he was known as the East Area Rapist with something like 100 rapes. Allegedly, because they couldn't get all of them because technology. And then finally, he was known as the first Night Stalker. He was the Night Stalker, that name, before Richard Ramirez. Because again, modus operandi, breaking into homes, because he obviously mastered that as the ransacker. Then he mastered that. Escalation, escalation, escalation. So here you have someone who was clearly descending into madness. And the last one for tonight, 1979 to 1981. What makes this person an interesting trivia note is that you had someone who was such an accomplished football player that they actually made it from the NFL draft, made it to the NFL, but was cut in training camp. Had the person made the team after all of that, it's possible that none of this would have happened. But after not making it in the NFL, Randall Woodfield became known as the I-5 killer, convicted for 18 murders and implicated in up to 44. Again, all young women in this case. I mean, the one, I think, recurring theme, with the exception of someone like a Samuel Little and a Donald Harvey, it really is all teenagers for the most part. Carl Eugene Watts was all over the place as well. Teenagers and its promises of alcohol and drugs. It was the 70s. Teenagers partied probably a lot harder than they do now. I mean, I don't know that for certain. Yeah, kids still drink, do stupid shit, vape, weed, and all that. But it really was a different time. And even from when we were in our teens, so I think for most of us, our teens are going to be in the 80s and the 90s. And even then, I think I hitchhiked with my mom when I was little a couple of times, but my mom talked about hitchhiking all the time until it started to seem dangerous. And I'm sure that there were times that she was in the car with someone that was a little sketchy, right? Yeah, it's just the 70s. The 70s were just a odd time. And I think in many ways, when you hear about this and the changes both in law enforcement and parenting styles, you can't help but look at this absurd number of serial killers, active serial killers. Now, this isn't even everyone. I focused on the most famous cases, the ones who have the snazzy nickname for the newspapers, and those who had, with the exception of, let's see, so Rodney Alcala, firmly but suspected him anymore. That's why he's on the list. Now, Bittaker and Norris, 1979, it was just over the course of a few months, and for them, it's the depravity of it all that makes them on this, list, if you will, and the media sensationalism that went along with it. But there's people out there who are 3, 4, and I don't want to dismiss that, because those are also human beings. I just mean for the purposes of the podcast, of course, because there were, just in the 70s, from 1970 to 1979, I think there's still another 24. And they also have things on there like Kaczynski, the Unabomber, right? Technically a serial killer by that, measure, right? Which is multiple victims independently. Now, one of the other things that's come up a number of times as well in various things that I've read is that when they talk about how we no longer have really serial killers, but now we do have mass murder. So some have said that you don't have the serial killer anymore because of all these things, but instead you have your mass shooters, for example, and those are the serial killers of the 2000s. But they're not called serial killers because it's done all at one time. Mass murderer, serial killer, either way, it's massive losses of life, and usually on what they call soft targets. Easy targets. So that is the serial killers of the 1970s. It is that Halloween time of year where all things creepy, gory, scary, horrific all come to the forefront. And I guess we'll have to do a part 2, but maybe I'm going to save that for next year, because I don't know if I could keep reading about this stuff. It really is sickening. And as I was going through, I got about midway, I got to Gacy, and I'm I am gassed, just talking about it. It's one thing to read it, but to talk about it out loud, and you hear yourself saying these things, you go, oh my gosh, These are humans doing these terrible things to other humans, and it just defies what we know about. Well, I shouldn't say that. It doesn't defy what we know about humanity, but I think for most of us, it defies what we think humanity should be, or could be, or what we all hope it is. That we're all, for the most part, inherently good. But then there's these folks that obviously defy that. There was no inherent goodness, and maybe there was at a time. Small children, I never think children are evil or capable of evil. I'm sure there are very isolated cases, and they're born usually of significant mental illness, normally born by trauma and abuse. So anyway, that has been Serial Killers Part 1, the 70s edition. So tell me, what do you think? Do you like having topics like this? Too heavy? Too gross? Too much? Or do you like these kind of long-form discussions about things? Sometimes going beyond just the pop culture stuff. I did an episode on the Cold War. It seemed to be pretty well received. Do you like stuff like this? Do you like topics like this? Please let me know. And how do you do that? You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, comment, share, leave 5-star reviews, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.